Good afternoon and welcome to Mastering Medical Device Security, a health system CIO Media Inc. production sponsored by Medigate. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. My name is Anthony Guerra. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Health System CIO and I'll be your moderator today. We're looking forward to some audience participation. Send your questions or comments in at any time in the Q&A box and we will take them later in the program. And we'll be putting out a little poll, a one-question poll later in the program, get you to respond, and we'll have our panelists guess on the results, see who wins. Nice way to view the screen today. Top center should get it into side-by-side mode. Then you can adjust the divider in the middle to get the slides and the video boxes the size you like. And it should say speaker view in the top right-hand corner. Just so you see how we're going to spend our time, we're going to go about 35, 40 minutes with our panel featuring Stephen Dunkle, Chief Information Security Officer with Geisinger Health System, Brian Sterud, VP and CIO at Faith Regional Health Services, and Jonathan Langer, co-founder and CEO at Medigate. So let's jump right into what I think is going to be a very interesting conversation. Steve, let's start with you. Can you give us an overview of your organization and your role there?
Sure. First off, welcome everyone. Again, I'm Steve Dunkle. I work for Geisinger, which is located in central Pennsylvania, Danville, Pennsylvania specifically. Geisinger has 12 hospitals at the current time. We have roughly 2,500 licensed inpatient beds, hundreds of clinics. We have a health information exchange. We have a health plan. We also have a research division and a school of medicine. And with a level 1 trauma center, we also have a life flight group with, I believe we have 9 helicopters at this time. So it is a fully integrated system.
Very good. Thanks, Steve. Brian?
Good morning. Thanks, Anthony. Brian Sterud, VP Chief Information Officer at Faith Regional Health Services, located in Norfolk, Nebraska. So that's in northeast Nebraska. Organization covers quite a geography just due to the rural nature of how we're set up here. We have one hospital. We have a couple of affiliate hospitals. So a little bit different size than Stephen. Own physician practice that's with locations scattered around northeast Nebraska as well. Some things that we do that others maybe don't in the size community of ours is we have a heart program, we have a cancer program, and so we do some things that others our size don't do. And like I said, we cover quite a geography in terms of where our service area is.
Very good. Thank you, Jonathan.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm Jonathan. I'm the CEO of Medigate. What we do is at Medigate, we're a healthcare security company, and we're also involved in clinical asset optimization. We're about 100 people in the company at this point, working only with HDOs. So we've had some experience over the last couple of years with regard to medical device security, which we're going to talk about today. And looking forward to the discussion.
Very good. All right, first question, Brian, we're going to start with you. Oftentimes, visibility is referred to as the first step in a solid security program. Would you agree? And what's the biggest challenge in obtaining visibility in a healthcare environment?
Yeah, I think some of this has changed over the years. Certainly visibility is a huge step in understanding and being able to demonstrate that the importance of that and gain buy-in from the organization. I would agree for the most part. And biggest challenge, I think that challenge is dramatically changed over the years. I think with the number of incidents that we've seen in, I'll say, the last 4 or 5 years or so, it's really demonstrated a need from board of directors, upper management, and an understanding, and it's kind of obtained that visibility on our own in many ways. So I find that this problem is much easier than it would have been 4 or 5 years ago. But I do agree, and I think Right now, it's about translating that challenge. So translating that visibility into having the conversation with the organization about risk, about how their dollars are invested and what the return is, or you know, that type of conversation is probably the biggest challenge now once that visibility has been gained.
Stephen?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And it's not only medical devices, obviously, I think cybersecurity in general, visibility. One of the experiments I tried a couple years ago that fortunately has worked out is I actually brought someone onto the team that has a very strong communications background and in marketing. And at the time, we wondered if this was really a good move. But that has worked very well because, as you said, with medical device, with all the threats that are coming and the expansion of those type of devices and IoT, having someone out there working closely with our communications department, almost daily communicating on this and talking with people has been extremely beneficial.
So, Stephen, they're educated. This is about getting the word out so people behave properly with devices and take proper security steps and precautions. This is helping to educate and convince. So rather than just communicating to marketing, you brought someone into your team who deals with that, and I assume also works with the marketing department, but it's like embedded in your group, correct?
Correct.
That's interesting. Very interesting. Okay. Go ahead.
I was just saying, it's actually worked better than I expected. It's the first time in my career I've done something like that, but it's proven itself quite well.
Very interesting. Jonathan?
Sure. I think to me, with regard to the changes that we've been seeing in healthcare over the last 5 years or so in this industry, I guess to Stephen's point is that there are more and more devices that are beginning to be connected to the network. There's IoT devices, whether it's medical devices that are now more connected than they used to be, significantly, enterprise IoT, clinical devices, and so on. To me, the diversity of the devices that are now being connected, and also just the sheer multitude of devices that are being connected, is creating a new problem. And to Brian's point, I do think that this is certainly a problem that the board of directors and the major stakeholders within the enterprise should be aware of, because something has changed in terms of connectivity over the last couple of years. So I would definitely agree with that.
What about the idea that Brian expressed, which is that it's easier to gain visibility today? I assume you mean, Brian, because of some of the tools that are available. Why don't you go into that a little more, Brian, why it's easier today?
I maybe have to fess up. I thought you were talking about generally speaking and building security awareness within your organization. So that was the context in which I was answering that question in terms of the importance of security in general as a program versus visibility to devices.
Okay, so you think in general it's easier today, but people are more understanding of why security is important?
And it's much, much easier to sell security right now than it was,
right.
years ago.
Right. People get it now. All right, very good. Next question, Jonathan, let's start with you. How can hospitals determine the risk level of individual assets, and how is the clinical impact of each device taken into account?
So that's an interesting point. One thing that I've seen over the last couple of years is that risk in HDOs is measured differently. Unfortunately, there isn't one standard that I've seen out there that in terms of the actual detail of how you articulate risk that is out there for everyone. So I will open up and say that I think it's okay for everyone to customize in their own way, just because the way that they see the risk for their enterprise is different. And that makes sense to me. And to me, I think that's the reality. In terms of the guidelines as to how to look at risk, the way that I would look at this, just leaning on the common frameworks that are used by professionals out there, is basically a combination of a probability and impact. That's the way to look at it. When I look at probability of occurrence in an HDO, I think we need to look at the inherent vulnerabilities of the devices. We need to, and at the same time, we also need to look at compensating controls. That's what would weigh out the probability in my eyes. And then in impact, I think there's a really big challenge here, because when it comes to those medical devices, for the most part, how do you measure the clinical impact of a device? How do you measure the importance of that and how it can affect patient safety? How can it affect patient privacy? How can it affect potential revenue for the organization, for the enterprise as a whole? So that's the tricky one that I think a lot of folks are having trouble with. And it's really about knowing what the device is doing and what its identity is in order to be able to articulate the risk, or I'd say the clinical impact of that specific asset.
What about reputation, Jonathan? Is that another metric that you try and figure out the possible impact?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the discussions that I've had with HDOs in the past is, how do you factor in reputation as part of the overall financial risk? Because some devices I'd say are more prone to getting that sort of negative attention than others may have. And it is a discussion that has come up, and it's not easy to do so. And that's why I always say that I think every HDO does things a little bit differently, and that's okay in my eyes. But it has come up, absolutely.
Stephen, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I guess, at least relative to our journey, one of the first things is getting our hands around the actual inventory of assets. It's kind of hard to do a real risk assessment, in my mind, for an effective one if you don't understand what you've got. And that's an ongoing challenge for us. So that's definitely a component of it. The other part is, originally in starting the journey specific to medical devices, the general concentration in the organization seemed to be on information. And personally, I'm probably equally, if not more, concerned about the integrity of the device. And helping the organization understand the part of security isn't just, hey, we're going to lose PHI with this. What actually happens to your reputation standpoint if somebody gets in and changes this thing unauthorized and it hurts a patient? So we definitely add that as a definite weight in it. The other thing I might comment is, in this journey, we were looking at medical devices, and we quickly discovered there's more risk than just medical devices when you get into this non-traditional space. For example, sewage treatment systems. Most of them are under some sort of a process control environment, elevators. And so as we started to lift up the rock, overall risk assessment and the whole inventory piece I mentioned has definitely made it a much bigger exercise than we anticipated.
Stephen, you talked about how important it is and how difficult it can be to even get an inventory of what you have. And I would imagine it's made even more difficult by the fact that things are always being purchased, things are always being sunset. So let's say you were able to stop time and get your inventory. That's not how it works, and that would be hard enough. So part of this is getting the purchasing under control and getting that streamlined to where everything comes up, it hits IT and especially hits you. And so that way you can keep an inventory, not just get an inventory, you can keep it. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, the whole onboarding process and the aspect, in my mind, what you're talking about, it fits into the supply chain security aspect. We do assess our vendors, sometimes to the point they get a little frustrated with us, but it's with all good intent. But yeah, you're absolutely right. If it comes into the door bad to begin with, you're already behind. behind the curve. I don't know, Jonathan, what's your thoughts on that?
It's a really interesting point where I think in the past, I'd say, or in some organizations, you would see supply chain and security disjointed to a certain extent. So what would happen, and I have seen this, is that the security folks would have to deal with the security repercussions of buying an insecure device after the fact, which is always much tougher, right? Because it's already on your network, and now you're dealing with some trouble. And one of the things that, just in terms of governance, which I think is a really good practical step, and Stephen, it sounds like that's the way that you folks are doing it, is assessing the risk of the device that's going to come into the network ahead of time, so that the security considerations are taken into account during the procurement phase. And in fact, I think that they should be weighed in as part of the scoring of that specific vendor. Of course, maybe the clinical care capabilities outweighs the security. I can understand that and I can respect that, but at least security has a place. And getting supply chain and security to have that process buttoned up, I think that's in terms of enterprise security maturity is a really important step.
Certainly,
Jonathan, go ahead, Stephen.
I was just going to say, it certainly makes partnership with the vendors or the manufacturers, from our standpoint, the ones that are easy to work with and really care about security, those are the folks we want to deal with.
Exactly. Could not agree more.
Stephen and Jonathan, I would imagine that if you're trying to deal with security after the fact, if it got in the door because of the procedures weren't there to make sure you looked at it beforehand, you've also lost some leverage in terms of getting the vendor to do certain things. Before the purchase, you have, with the procurement process, you have a lot more influence than afterwards. Is that correct, Stephen?
Definitely. Very good point.
Anthony, I wanted to share a quick story on that. So we put into place, because of some of this exact issue where you end up with something on your network and you're dealing with it after the fact, and as many experienced number of challenges and frankly frustration related to that. And so we put into place some mechanisms where almost anything has to have sign off, and so I would joke even. I had our plant services director come to me, and I have to sign off on anything over a certain dollar value. And he came to me with carpet one day, and I kind of laughed. I said, well, is this going to be network connected? And it was kind of our joke. But the next time, not that long after that, I had our nursing home. We have a nursing home as well. Our nursing home administrator bring to me a bathtub, and I jokingly said, hey, is this going to be network connected? And they said, no, it's not. However, there is a model that we did consider that would have been connected so that we could monitor the temperature and adjust the temperature if needed. So it's gone. It's funny, but not funny, because it's gone from what I thought was a fairly innocent joke to now I'm kind of asking, when you bring anything to me,
That's a great story. Yep. You never know these days, right? So everything should at least get a look.
Right.
Very good. All right, next question. Brian, we'll start with you here. With the acceleration of digitization in healthcare, common devices, the BYOD devices, being used by clinicians and employees could house PHI or information used for medical purposes. How are hospitals addressing that?
Yeah, for us, if it has anything to do with patient care, and we're an Epic customer, so if they're going to use functions of Epic on a device, we require that it's managed by our mobile device management tool, and that's how we address it, to make sure that it is secured properly and that it's walled off properly. Anyone that would want to do that, we simply don't allow them to without our mobile device management tool.
Stephen, is this difficult issue, or is this kind of solved in your mind that there's ways to deal with the BYOD?
Never solved. It's an ongoing exercise. I think we're doing good at it. Could we do better? Definitely. But as Brian said, just putting the discipline around it as much as we can, looking at things like mobile access management, mobile device management, containerization, all the techie stuff. But also, obviously, it's in the hands of the person that has the mobile device. So there's a lot of training there. Again, I see this as probably something that's going to be going on for probably at least 5 years. The whole mobile device, telemedicine, it all fits in together, cloud. So it's going to be a moving target. Fortunately, a lot of the mobile device manufacturers are starting to put some controls, some of which can fortunately be integrated with our organization controls. But yeah, BYOD, I actually am for it, but I'm for it in obviously in a properly controlled environment. So long-winded answer.
Stephen, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question here. What do you think is the key to having, you're going to laugh, I know you're going to laugh, to having the right personality to be a CISO? Because I would imagine the kind of person that gets into security likes to have their I's dotted, the T's crossed, likes specificity, things to be clean, buttoned up, neat. But it sounds like the job requires being comfortable with a lot of, not chaos, but a lot of things that you're still trying to get your arms around. Things are never done. You never get everything Ziploc done clean. It's always messy. So what kind of personality do you need to be able to be comfortable with that?
Resilience. I believe that's the biggest. In our field, I see a lot of my peers, and myself included. You get in this game, you got to understand, if you want to be a CISO, you, as I put it, you have to be able to take it on the chin. Not just once, not just twice, constant. And just stay in there and do what's right for the organization. Stand by your principles, but also pick your battles. But to me, it's very much take the job. There's a lot comes with it, and you better just be ready to manage it and deal with it. And that includes finding time to literally let it go. You have to do that.
Is it the kind of thing where probably every CISO you spoke to would say, I don't have enough budget or I need more budget?
Yeah. And it's going, I think if you look at the numbers, when you talk to consultants at Gartner and Forrester and others, and just talking with my peers, I think all of us, based on what I'm hearing, the budgets are going the wrong direction in comparison to threats. But it's just the reality. I mean, the pandemic and everything, we've got to do what's right for the organization so they can survive and help our patients.
So, Jonathan, let's go to you on that. A couple of things. So, number one, if you want to comment on what we were discussing about the resilience, Stephen was saying the resilience is the number one thing. And then he also mentioned the budget's going in the wrong direction, which I know we were going to touch on later, but let's touch on it now. Greater security threats, less money to deal with them because of the COVID impact. So you want to take those one at a time, that'd be great.
Sure. So I'm sure resilience, Stephen is saying that for a reason. I'm sure there's some history and experience there. I would certainly agree. Maybe outside of resilience, one characteristic that I certainly appreciate with security professionals, of course, resilience, but also being good listeners and understanding the needs of the business. I think with all the technological changes that are happening and the craziness around COVID, which has accelerated some of the digitalization, and I think telehealth is a good example of that. And we talked about that a little bit in this conversation. Just understanding, listening to what the clinicians and to what the staff needs and what the patients needs. I think that's key. So I definitely agree with that. And then with regard to budgets, I think that obviously with the impact of COVID on the economy, unfortunately, I think this is the decreasing budgets, or at least being more mindful of budgets, is something that we're all going to have to deal with in this industry and in other industries, but certainly in healthcare, which has been impacted, of course, and is on the front lines, literally. To me, what that means, or one of the considerations that I would recommend, is really being able to articulate clear ROI with new tools that I'm bringing in as a CISO or as a security professional in the organization. Real hard ROI, which is a challenge for any vendor, and myself included. But I think it's possible to leverage technology for that. And the reason also why I would mention CISOs in this regard is that more often than not, what I'm seeing is that the security folks are what I would call technological trailblazers within the organization. And I think they have kind of a second role outside of security, if that wasn't enough. Also to bring in new technologies that can benefit the entire enterprise, bringing them to other groups and other stakeholders that can also benefit from that, and being able to bring everyone together to really show ROI that would benefit in this day and age, the enterprise as a whole. So that would be my comment on that.
Brian, do you have a CISO, or do you function in that capacity?
I actually function in that capacity as well at our organization.
So what would you say would be the salient qualities of someone who's going to head up security in a healthcare system?
Well, I think they've kind of touched on it a little bit, but I think it's about I guess I'll say two things: partnership and risk tolerance. So, if you cannot have productive conversations and partner with your clinical teammates and your financial teammates, it's hard to get anywhere. So there has to be that, and I think Stephen probably alluded to that a little bit in terms of the pick your battles. If it's dealt with the rigidity and a very strict sort of black and white, that might be the right thing to do, but you're going to be a failure in my opinion. There has to be the ability to talk about some gray areas and to be able to work together to accomplish things. Risk tolerance, I think, goes along with that same thing. If again, I think sometimes I'll encounter people that are very forthright with what they think needs to be done, and again, they may be right, but that means that they're eliminating all risk. And if your goal is to eliminate all risk, there again, you're not gonna succeed. I have a friend of mine that I came up through the ranks with. Was administering our firewall at the place we were at. This is probably, I don't know, almost 20 years ago. And somebody said they really wanted to make sure our internet was secure. We were a financial services company at the time. And he said, that's great. I'm just going to go unplug this one cable from the WAN side of this firewall. And he was joking, but again, if you want to remove all risk, that's the only way to do it. But nobody can function in a no risk environment, because you also aren't gaining any rewards either. So it's the ability to work with the organization and understand where are the risks appropriate, where can we accept the risks and we're okay with that, where do we put in mitigating, compensating controls, and those sorts of things.
So that's great stuff. I wrote, I've got three things down here as to make me think of. If you don't have these things, you're going to top out in your security career. You're not going to reach that level of being an executive. You may be able to do certain things, but you shouldn't interact with other people, so to speak. So it's the partnership that Brian mentioned. It's the risk tolerance. If you can't take that, if you need everything buttoned up and clean, and you have to unplug the cable, you're not gonna get very high. The other thing I wrote down is a desire and enjoyment of continuing education, right? I mean, if you're going to be a CISO, you have to be interested to the point that you attend webinars, you're reading reports, because this stuff will pass you by in a heartbeat, I would imagine. So all good stuff, very good. All right, next question. Steve, I'm going to start with you. Oftentimes, patching of remediation of vulnerabilities is not an option. How can hospitals address risk mitigation through other measures, such as zero trust, network-centric policy enforcement, et cetera? So educate me real quick. Why is sometimes patching or remediation of vulnerabilities not an option?
Well, I've always taken the stand, and I think most people do, that service wins. And so security gives way to that. And so if there is a technical constraint or a high dollar requirement for patching a system, risk management has to come into play. What's the business benefit of that system versus weighed against the risk of it? And going back to our earlier conversation, you got to pick your battles sometimes. You have to work within the business to find the right balance. And I've always said that, you know, accepting of risk is part of business. It's what we're trained with right out of the university. It's in my mind that part of that, though, is understanding the risk. The other part is the acceptance or tolerance of it is made in the right jurisdiction. So if it's very high level, very high risk, you probably want your senior executives aware of that in signing off, so to speak. But then from a compensating and mitigating control perspective, there are some things you can do, and that's part of what I view as risk management, is what can we do? Can we put it behind a firewall? As you said, with some of the new technologies coming out with SD-WANs and things like that, how can we isolate that problem child, so to speak, so we can keep the business running and still do a reasonable job of protecting the organization?
Stephen, would you say that it is not, excuse me, it is not the CISO's job to decide what level of risk the organization wishes to accept? It is your job to explain the risk and to let the business owners decide?
Yeah, I think, you know, usually I get asked to make a vote, but I agree with you with your comment 100%. Our role is to advise. Our role is to help people understand both what the situation is and how it could go wrong, and if it did, to what degree. But the actual tolerance of risk, no, that's not our role, in my mind.
Jonathan, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think risk management is the key word here. And the reality is because of financial purposes or service purposes, you're not gonna always be able to patch the devices that you need to patch. The problem is even worse when it comes to medical devices, because sometimes there is no patch. The manufacturer of the medical device hasn't issued a patch yet because they're validating, going through the process that it won't affect patient safety and the overall stability of the device. So you may be waiting for a long time, and even afterwards, maybe it's not your first priority. So to me, risk management is definitely a key to this process. The good news, in my eyes, speaking of, let's call it new or my modern technological capabilities, is that even in lieu of a patch, there are other compensating controls, whether it's with a firewall, with a NAC solution, etc., that you can actually use to segment the device, kind of going to clinical zero trust or segmentation of some sort so that you can isolate the problem child, I'll use Stephen's words, to mitigate some of the risk, even if a patch has not been delivered there. So the advice that I could provide or suggest is that always look at this in a combined strategy in terms of what am I going to remediate in terms of patching, and then how am I going to mitigate risk where I wasn't able to deliver a patch and get the vulnerability out of my system entirely. And then this is always a moving target because new vulnerabilities are coming out every day. So it's going to be a process more than a one-time thing.
Brian, thoughts?
Yeah, a lot of them similar to what these gentlemen have already stated. You know, I think, you know, we just went through a very in-depth process and actually aren't quite complete with this in terms of assessing the level of risk, assessing why the risk is high depending on the device, understanding what our options are for each device. So in some cases, there is an upgrade that's involved that we could actually get accomplished. In some cases, as Jonathan said, there may not even be an upgrade, so there may be no option in that regard. And frankly, when you're faced with that, you're down to the service part of what Stephen talked about is if there is no patch and it is a high risk, then your only option is to remove it. And in most cases, that's not going to fly. So we just worked through this process. Some of it comes down to in the dollar amount. So in some of the cases that we ran into, there's a significant dollar amount for the vendor to do what they needed to do. So in those cases, we use a micro-segmentation technology. So we're segmenting those devices off and making sure that they can only do what they're supposed to be able to do on our network. And we're in the kind of the first stages of that. That's gone really well. So that's one option. And I'll say too, really quick, you know, some of the vendors, you know, they're not issuing patches. And in one case, the vendor actually, what they were charging us for the upgrade was doing nothing more than putting a firewall in front of it. So they actually weren't addressing the vulnerability or removing the vulnerability. They were just selling us a solution that involved firewalling it. And at that point, we already had the technology that we utilized. So we said, that's fine, we'll do it on our own. So.
All right, very interesting. Okay, I want to get our poll question out there, have a little fun with this, which we're going to launch now. And our panelists can vote too, so please do so. Medical device vulnerabilities are the #1 issue that keeps healthcare IT security professionals up at night. That's the favorite expression, up at night, right? When it comes to security professionals, what keeps you up at night? So go ahead and answer that, and then we will look at the results and we'll have our brilliant panelists guess at the results. I want to get one audience question out there first before we look at our poll results. So let's go to you first, Brian. How do you engage your organization's clinical engineers and/or biomedical equipment technicians to determine clinical impact? These professionals deal with that impact daily. So are there folks that you go to get that information? How does that work?
So change that, and many others have done this as well, but a change that we made that tremendously increased our level of success here was biomedical engineering reports to me now. So I think that's something that anybody, you know, there was a time where that maybe wasn't a necessity, and in my opinion, it's a necessity now for anybody in my type of position. And so that allows a lot better communication, allows me to make sure, and frankly, to support them as well. You know, in the past, sometimes they maybe didn't have the opportunity to push back on certain things depending on what they found. So I'd say that formal reporting relationship and then the ongoing dialogue. One thing that in particular that we did was we worked through it's kind of our own algorithm on how we assess risk relative to devices based on certain characteristics. So that was another huge advancement. So it gives us a risk profile for every single device that we have that they manage. And then based on that, it scores and we have risk stratification. And so then it gives us the opportunity to work through the highest risk devices first. And that's proven to be tremendously successful for us.
Steve?
I think overall it basically just risk management and staying with the the discipline to follow it.
Okay, very good. Jonathan, anything you want to add on that about the reporting structures and clinical engineering and biomed and all that?
I think in terms of governance structures, there are all sorts of governance structures that at least I've seen in terms of who reports to who and how all of this is done. I think that the most important point, at least that I've seen with organizations that have been successful, is creating some sort of dialogue, open channel for dialogue, whether it's a standing meeting or some sort of committee that is able to address this the security issue and the various stakeholders that are there. And once you got communication and people that have a relationship and a partnership, then the sky's the limit. The real big challenge, and this is honestly where I've seen organizations being unsuccessful, is where you try to take an initiative and you're doing it in a siloed way, where it's just owned by the biomed folks or just the security folks or IT or whoever that may be. And then when they reach out to the other side of the organization for help, they don't get that help just because there wasn't communication. So I would definitely advise against that and go for that committee or line of communication.
So, and Anthony, to Jonathan's point, along these lines, we have formed a steering committee for medical device security, again, to Jonathan's point, and clinical engineering is a very active part of that. And we found them very good in coming to the table with us, as is IT in that also, because they support the network that those devices are on.
Very good. All right, we're going to look at our poll results. So let's get our panelists to guess here. So what percentage do you think agree with the statement that medical device vulnerabilities are the #1 issue? Jonathan, give me a number.
I'm going to go with 40%.
40?
Yes.
Okay. Brian?
I think it's tough because this is a little skewed based on the topic of the conversation. I'm gonna go 60%.
60. Steve?
30%.
30%. All right, let's share the results. 50%. You got a 50-50 split.
So split.
So I guess that's John and Brian. That's a tie, right?
Well, is it like The Price is Right, where it was the closest without going over or anything, was it?
Well,
Without going over. So that means Jonathan, you win. Sorry, Brian.
That's all right.
Well done. So that's a 50-50, and I guess it's close. I wonder if the people who disagreed would probably put it #2, but we won't know that. All right, another audience question, and this is for Brian. How do you handle vendor remote access, such as Webex, when utilizing microsegmentation, as Webex has so many, in caps, IP addresses?
So we haven't had to deal with that quite yet, to be honest with you. So it really hasn't had to be an issue. When we have had things, we're in the beginning part of this venture, when we have had a lot of times the vendors on site. So we really haven't had to deal with that issue quite yet.
Stephen, any thoughts on that? Has it come into your world at all?
Well, nothing against Webex other than for this particular application. That's not something I would overly be comfortable with. I understand why there's situations where you might use it, but overall, in our environment, we have developed sort of a central gateway for vendors to come in using a commercial tool where they log in with multi-factor and all that. Plus, it records their session if we turn it on. So it's more of a, if you're going to come into our organization, you come in through the central gateway.
Very good. All right. We're going to go, we got a couple more minutes left. So we're going to go to our Ask a Co-Panelist segment. I want to give Jonathan a chance to ask one or both of his co-panelists a question, something he's dying to know.
So I'll ask this, since I saw what your thoughts were with regard to the polling question. So my question for Stephen and for Brian is, what does keep you up at night? What would be that #1 priority?
Brian?
Yeah, so the reason I was thinking about this when I saw what the question was, and I thought it may be skewed high based on the topic, but I'll just say, generally speaking, end user behavior that's what keeps me up at night the most. You can put all the controls in that you want. You can do all the things technologically that you want to do, and ultimately, your biggest risk is your employees. So we try to spend a lot of time on building, security awareness, and we do internal phishing, as many do. But we try to spend a lot of time on education of end users and promoting those users, bringing things forward to us when there's something that doesn't feel right. So that's the one that keeps me up at night more than the medical device security.
Stephen?
Actually, for me, it's enabling the business. And what I mean by that is there are so many things going on in the organization nowadays with innovation and lean and things like that. How do you implement security controls effectively with all these moving parts and still help the business meet their objectives? And it's a double-edged sword. The fun in our field is creativity and being able to, come up with great ideas for enablement. But in today's world, and I'm sure all my peers share it, the workload's phenomenal. In the understanding, how can I enable this key business objective without disrupting usability?
That's a really good one. Very good points on both ends. So I think, Jonathan, I'm going to give you an opportunity for sort of a last word here before we get going. So any advice you want to give on, obviously the topic today was medical device security. So any final words of wisdom to the IT executives on the line today that are obviously grappling with this issue and maybe don't feel like they totally are in a good place, even considering risk. We all know, we said it's not going to be perfect. You're never going to, it's like herding cats, right? Okay, we get comfortable with that, but what do you want to say to the folks that are just not comfortable with their control of the herd, so to speak?
Sure. So as a technology vendor myself, I could offer all sorts of technological best practices and tools and so on. But really, the best advice that I would have, that I would really encourage folks to use, is starting with process and governance. And to me, the #1 thing about medical device security, since it involves several stakeholders within the enterprise, is going back to our discussion about open lines of communication and getting that steering committee or some sort of body to handle it. That would be the best advice that I would have, and it would ensure a good security program. Starting with the tech is the wrong way to go. You got to start with the process, and that's what I would encourage.
Excellent advice. We appreciate that. That is about all we had time for today. Great conversation. I truly enjoyed it. Regarding continuing education, you could use the final slide in this deck. You'll get an email when the on-demand recording of this event is ready for viewing. If you want to sponsor an event with our team, you can reach out to Nancy Wilcox, and you can go to our website, to register for our robust schedule of upcoming events. With that, I want to very much thank our panel, Steve Dunkle, Brian Sterud, and Jonathan Langer, and I want to thank Medigate for sponsoring and making this conversation possible. And I want to thank you for attending. With that, everybody, have a wonderful day. Thank you.